All right, we're live. How's everybody doing? Hotep, hey, this is Michael Imhotep, founder of the African History Network, host of the African History Network show. I'm a talk show host, researcher, lecturer, and writer. It is Saturday, June 1st, 2019, and we're live finally. I was trying to go live and run into some technical difficulties. Okay, so hope everybody's doing well today. Share this broadcast on your Facebook page. Invite your friends to tune in also. So today is June 1st, and this is the 98th anniversary of the massacre at Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. In North Tulsa, the Greenwood district was the business district in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So I'm going to talk some about the history of Black Wall Street, and there was a new first-hand account that surfaced in 2018. Washington Post has a good article about this, written by Deneen L. Brown, called "They was killing black people." Okay, in Tulsa, a century-old massacre still haunts Black Wall Street. Is the let me go to this right here. And yeah, it talks about in Tulsa, one of the worst episodes of racial violence in U.S. history still haunts the city with unresolved questions as Black Wall Street gentrifies. Okay, so everybody share this broadcast on your Facebook page. Invite your friends to tune in. This is a real history lesson, and I've studied a lot dealing with the history of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I'm in a documentary dealing with the history of Black Wall Street, but also I have I've actually done a 2.5-hour presentation dealing with the history of Black Wall Street from destruction to the resurrection of economic empowerment. So this is available at our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. It's a 2.5-hour lecture, and I deal with a lot of the history leading up to the attack on Black Wall Street in 1921, and I deal with a lot of history. So it's on sale right now. We have it on DVD and digital download at AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. So I just posted the links here, and it's right on the homepage of our website. Okay, so when we look at some of this history, and what we see now taking place in Tulsa is that Tulsa is being gentrified now. Okay, and this deals with ties into the gentrification taking place all across the country, in Detroit, Washington, D.C., African Americans being pushed out, white people moving in, and the price of the property goes up, the rent goes up, so that a lot of African Americans can't afford to live there. And this is what's happening in Tulsa right now in the Greenwood district, what used to be the Greenwood district. This is happening right now. Now, what's interesting about Tulsa, Oklahoma, is that a lot of African Americans don't know the history of Black Wall Street. And doing a lot of my research dealing with the history of Black Wall Street, and I'm in the documentary Resurrecting Black Wall Street, the Blueprint, from Dr. Boyce Watkins and Your Black World Films. And I did a lot of research preparing for that documentary and preparing for the lecture I did dealing with the history of Black Wall Street. The lecture was actually my research in preparation for the documentary. But I read this book here by Hannibal B. Johnson. And this is Black Wall Street from Riot to Renaissance in Tulsa's Historic Greenwood Districts. Fantastic, fantastic book. Probably one of the best books dealing with the history of Black Wall Street. And I've seen most of the documentaries dealing with the history of Black Wall Street. I've seen those. I've read some books. Robin Walker, who wrote the book When We Ruled. He's a brilliant historian. He's in Hidden Colors #4. Robin Walker has a smaller book dealing with the history of Black Wall Street, but this is so you can get that one from Robin Walker also. But this is an excellent book by Hannibal B. Johnson. He really did the research. Okay, so I want to look at this article from 3 main articles. I'm going to look at one from Washington Post, another one from Ebony, okay, and then also one from NPR.org, which is an interview with Olivia Hooker. And Olivia Hooker was probably the last known survivor of the Black Wall Street Massacre. Okay, so if we look at this article from the Washington Post. This is from September 28th, 2018. How's everybody doing? Share this broadcast on your Facebook page. And also African American business owners, post the name of your business here on the thread of the broadcast. We'll let you know how you can advertise with the African History Network. Email us at customerservice@africanhistorynetwork.com, customerservice@africanhistorynetwork.com. We have a couple new advertisers, the Fast Life 28-Day Challenge, the Fast Life 28-Day Challenge, and waffles and Mercedes Waffles and More.com, MercedesWafflesandMore.com. You hear about that as well. Okay, so let's look at this fantastic article by Deneen L. Brown from the Washington Post. Okay, they was quote, they was killing black people, end quote. In Tulsa, one of the worst episodes of racial violence in U.S. history still haunts the city with unresolved questions, even as Black Wall Street gentrifies. And the article talks about an African-American female city councilwoman named Vanessa Hall Harper. Okay? And Vanessa Hall Harper talks about the Oak Lawn Cemetery. And she talks about an area of the Oak Lawn Cemetery that's a grassy knoll in the Potter's Field section of Oak Lawn Cemetery. And she said, this is where the mass graves are. Now, she and others think that bodies were dumped here after one of the worst episodes of racial violence in U.S. history, the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. Okay. Now, for decades, few people talked about what happened in the city when a white mob descended on Greenwood Avenue, and which was a black business district that was so prosperous it was dubbed the Negro Wall Street by Booker T. Washington and became known as Black Wall Street. Okay, so the intersection of Greenwood, Archer, and Pine was like where the business district began, and it was known as Greenwood Avenue, the Greenwood District. Now, it was in what was known as North Tulsa. So back at this time, you have segregation taking place. We see that the Greenwood District comes into existence in the early 1900s, and because you have segregation taking place, South Tulsa is where the white people lived. North Tulsa is where African Americans were relegated. What separated South Tulsa from North Tulsa was the railroad track. Okay, now North Tulsa was derisively called Little Africa by white people, or it was called N-word town as well. Okay, and because oil is going to be discovered in Tulsa, Oklahoma in the early 1900s, you're going to have a wave of African Americans who are migrating into North Tulsa, seeking better opportunities, trying to leave the cotton fields, seeking their fortune, things like this. So you're going to have a swell in the population in Tulsa, Oklahoma, period, but also in North Tulsa. Okay, so when the attack happens in 1921, the population of North Tulsa is about 11,000. All right, so for decades, few people talked about what happened in this city. For 2 days beginning May 31st, 1921, the mob set fire to hundreds of African-American owned businesses and homes in Greenwood, okay, the Greenwood District, or in North Tulsa. More than 300 African-Americans were killed, although there's around 300 was the count by the Red Cross. The Red Cross is going to set up a makeshift hospital in Booker T. Washington High School. Even though a lot was destroyed, contrary to popular belief, the entire city was not destroyed. Okay, Booker T. Washington High School was still standing. And one of the most important stories and lessons to learn from the attack on Black Wall Street is that African Americans rebuilt Black Wall Street as well. We rebuilt it with our own dollars. We didn't get government help. A lot of the businesses that did have insurance on the businesses. The insurance companies did not pay out on the businesses. African Americans were blamed for the attack themselves. Some of the white newspapers reported on this and blamed African Americans for the attack themselves. So I mean, it's a really devastating history that took place. But there's also a lesson in the tenacity of African people also, that we rebuilt Black Wall Street after the race riot. So for 2 days beginning May 31st, 1921, the mob set fire to hundreds of African American owned businesses and homes in Greenwood. More than 300 people were killed. More than 10,000 people were left homeless. Now this is according to the Washington Post. Now I think it was Hannibal B. Johnson, because in my research it showed more than 4,000 people were left homeless, but it's hard to get an accurate count on that. So I've seen estimates between 4,000 left homeless up to 10,000 or more than 10,000 left homeless, and 40 blocks left smoldering. Survivors recounted black bodies loaded onto trains and dumped off bridges into the Arkansas River, and most frequently tossed into mass graves. And this is one of the reasons why it's hard to get an accurate count on how many African Americans were killed. In my research, I read accounts of African Americans talking about seeing bodies dumped into the river. We also know that there are going to be many of us who flee into surrounding cities and die in surrounding cities as well. Okay, they were wounded, fled into surrounding cities, died into surrounding cities. So it's hard to get an accurate count on how many died. But we know the Red Cross put the count at it's about 300 from the Red Cross. Okay, so now, as in this article from September 2018, now as Tulsa, Oklahoma prepares to commemorate the massacre's centennial in 2021 would be the 100th year anniversary. A community still haunted by its history is being transformed by a wave of new development in and around Greenwood. There's a minor league baseball stadium and plans for a BMX motocross headquarters. There's an arts district marketed to millennials, and a hip shopping complex constructed out of empty shipping containers. Okay, a hip shopping complex constructed out of empty shipping containers. There's a high-end apartment complex with a yoga studio and pub. Now you know this ain't for us. When they start talking about yoga studios, high-end apartment complexes, that's called gentrification. That's for white people. Now, while almost 2/3 of the neighborhood's residents are African American, the gentrification has surfaced tensions between the present and the past. Okay, questions about the scope of the rampage have never been resolved. Even the description of the violence is a point of contention, with some calling it the Tulsa Race Riot of 1921 and others referring to it as a massacre. Now, it's more of a massacre than a race riot. Okay. Now, even though African Americans did fight back, there were a lot of retired World War I veterans there, African American men. They were armed, they fought back and shot back. Okay. If we look at the article from ebony.com entitled, Ebony Magazine, ebony.com from May 31st, 2013, entitled Black Wall Street and the Destruction of the Institution by Josie Pickens. In this article, it talks about that contention in the language that's used to describe it. Okay, so in the article, she cites Linda Christensen. Okay, and this was Linda Christensen wrote this for the Zen Education Project, This was a article Linda Christensen wrote called "Burning Tulsa: The Legacy of Black Dispossession" from May 28, 2013, and ebony.com picked this up. Okay, so when we look at the segment cited in the article from ebony.com by Linda Christensen, Linda said, quote, "The term race riot does not adequately describe the events of May 31st through June 1st, 1921 in Greenwood. In fact, the term itself implies that both blacks and whites might be equally to blame for the lawlessness and violence. The historical record documents a sustained and murderous assault of black lives and property. This assault was met by a brave but unsuccessful armed defense of the community, by some African-American World War I veterans and others." Okay, so in a lot of the accounts of Black Wall Street, what's not talked about is that these brothers were armed and they fought back and shot back. Okay, that's left out of a lot of narratives dealing with the history of Black Wall Street. Now, during the night and day of the riot, deputized white men killed more than 300 African Americans. They looted and burned to the ground 40 square blocks of 1,265 African American homes, including hospitals, schools, and churches, and destroyed 150 businesses at least. Okay, white deputies and members of the National Guard arrested and detained 6,000 African American Tulsans who were released only upon being vouched for by a white employer or other white citizens. Okay, 9,000 African Americans were left homeless and lived in tents well into the winter of 1921. So what's not talked about is the detention camps that was set up, and you had, see, a lot of people talk about the wealth in Black Wall Street, and there were some wealthy African Americans. There were 20 some odd millionaires. You had all types of businesses. When we look at the article from financialjuneteenth.com, which talks about how there was more than one Black Wall Street. Let's see, they list, let me scroll down to this. Okay, so there were about 600 African American owned businesses, including 21 restaurants, 30 grocery stores, 2 movie theaters, a hospital, a bank, a post office, libraries, schools. They had their own school system. There were law offices, 6 private airplanes that were owned, a transportation bus system, 21 churches. They had all this taking place. But you had a lot of poor people, a lot of poor black people that lived there, and you had people who you had African Americans who worked in South Tulsa where white people lived. You had African Americans who were domestics, they were maids, butlers, things like this. And a lot of the African American owned businesses were dependent upon the maids coming into North Tulsa spending their money. So Thursday was known as Maids Night Off, and they would come into Tulsa and spend money at the restaurants and nightclubs, things like this, take advantage of that. So you had a lot of all of Black Wall Street was not opulence. You had poor black people that lived there as well. Okay, all right. So this is another side also that's not talked about either. Okay, so back to the article from Washington Post, and in the book by Hannibal B. Johnson, he talks about Thursday being Maids Night Off, and he talks about how a lot of the businesses there in Tulsa, would have 5, 6, 7 employees. So you have larger scale businesses, you had smaller scale businesses there as well. Okay, so let's go back to the article from the Washington Post. Now, Vanessa Hall Harper, who's an African American city council person there in Greenwood, her district includes Greenwood. She said, quote, "Before my mother died, I asked her what happened." Okay, and she said, quote, she said that her grandmother said they was killing black people and running them out of the city. "I didn't even know about the massacre until I was an adult, and I was raised here," she said. Okay, so she said her grandmother told her they was killing black people and running them out of the city. Now, Vanessa Hall Harper, who grew up in Greenwood in Tulsa, she said that "I didn't even know about the massacre until I was an adult and I was raised here. It wasn't taught about in the schools. It was too taboo. It was too taboo to teach about it in the schools." Now, though Tulsa, Oklahoma officials decided years ago not to excavate the site of the alleged mass grave, okay, at this Oakwood Cemetery, they argued that the evidence is not strong enough. Vanessa Hall Harper plans to ask the city to reconsider. She said, "In honor of the centennial coming up in 2021, I think we as a city should look into that and ensure those individuals are laid to rest properly," end quote. Okay, how's everybody doing? Share this broadcast on your Facebook page. Invite your friends to tune in also. Yeah, Michael Imhotep, host of the African History Network show, founder of the African History Network. Follow us here on our Facebook fan page, The African History Network, The African History Network, and on our YouTube channel, Michael Imhotep, IMHOTEP on YouTube. Also, if you'd like this type of information, you can donate to the African History Network, paypal.me/the AHN show. paypal.me/the AHN show, or at our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. Click on the yellow donate button on the home page. That helps us to keep doing the research, finance our Sunday night show, finance the research, pay the bills, stay on the air, etc. Then also we have the 2.5-hour lecture I did dealing with the history of Black Wall Street. We have it on DVD and digital download. We'll post a link here, and it's on the home page of our website, African History Network. The DVD is on sale $10, and the digital download is on sale $8. Okay, so I go deep into this history. It's a 2.5-hour presentation. It's called Black Wall Street: From Destruction to the Resurrection of Economic Empowerment. All right, let's continue. Let's see who we have. We have Larry, Mary, just a few of the people watching. Then African American business owners, post the name of your business here on the thread of the broadcast also. And email us at customerservice@AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. We'll let you know how you can advertise with the African History Network also. Okay. All right. So let's continue here. And where is this? All right. Let's go back to the article from the Washington Post. So a century ago, Tulsa, Oklahoma was racially segregated and reeling from a recent lynching when an African-American 19-year-old shoeshine boy, also called a bootblack, his name was Dick Rowland, walked into the Drexel building, which was an office building, which had the only toilet downtown available to African-Americans. You're dealing with segregation taking place. Now, Dick Rowland stepped into an elevator, and a 17-year-old white girl named Sarah Page was the elevator operator, and she began to shriek. Now, the accounts that I've read of it is that the elevator was not level when he walked in. When he crossed the threshold, it was not level. He trips, he reaches out, grabs her arm, she screams. People come running. They think he attacked her. He didn't attack her. Rumor spreads. She does not say she was raped or anything like that, but rumor spreads that there was some type of assault, and rumor is going to spread. And then when the white newspapers start printing articles about this, the Tulsa Tribune published a news story with the headline, "Nab Negro for attacking girl in elevator," even though he didn't attack her. And they ran an ominous editorial entitled, quote, "To lynch Negro tonight," end quote. To lynch Negro tonight. Okay, so this is going to cause all this to spread, all this to mushroom, to get out of hand and lead to this race riot, this massacre that took place. So so the article goes on to say, from Washington Post, quote, "While it is still uncertain as to precisely what happened in the Drexel building on May 30th, 1921, the most common explanation is that Dick Rowland stepped on Sarah Page's foot as he entered the elevator, causing her to scream," end quote. This was recorded by the Oklahoma Historical Society. This is what they reported. So we had the white newspapers that fanned the flames. Now, keep in mind that you had an increase in racial animus and racial violence leading up to 1921. Now, 1921 is 2 years before the Rosewood Massacre, which was in January 1923. 1921 is 2 years after 1919. 1919 was known as the Red Summer. Okay, and this was the year after World War I ended. World War I ends in 1918. And you have to look at a timeline of history to really understand this. Okay, so World War I starts in 1914. World War I is 1914 to 1918, and this is going to, in 1915, you're going to begin the what's known as the Great Migration. Great Migration, you have about 6 million African Americans migrating from the south up north and out west. 1915 is when the movie The Birth of a Nation comes out. It debuts February 8th, 1915. Okay, and that movie is going to resurrect the Ku Klux Klan. That movie depicts African Americans as being savage. All the negative stereotypes of African Americans are going to be depicted in that movie, The Birth of a Nation. It causes race riots in the streets. It's shown at the White House with President Woodrow Wilson. And the movie rejuvenates the Ku Klux Klan. The heroes of the movie are the Ku Klux Klan. And the movie takes place during slavery, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. And this is really this is really making a case for bringing slavery back into existence. The South, after the Civil War ends, had always made the case that the slavery, the peculiar institution, was good for everyone involved. They argued that it was good for enslaved Africans because the slave masters took care of the slaves and provided room and shelter for them, provided shelter and food for them. The slaves produced crops and goods. There were skill sets that the slaves had. There were at least 262 skills, trades, and crafts that African people had in this country from 1619 up until 1865. So the South is arguing that the institution of slavery was good for everybody. Okay, now I don't know how many enslaved Africans they polled for this. The concept of the happy slave is largely created by the South. And we see these images depicted in the movie The Birth of a Nation. Now the movie is 3 hours in length. It's a silent movie directed by D.W. Griffith. Okay, he introduced all types of new types of movie making techniques and shooting techniques, things like this. The movie is on YouTube. You can watch the entire movie on YouTube. It's a silent movie. They have captions, but it's a good, it's a pivotal piece in the history of this country because the movie helps to rejuvenate the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan are shown as heroes of the movie because at the end they put down this rebellion of former Union Negro soldiers. And the movie takes place in Piedmont, South Carolina. Okay. And all the negative stereotypical images of African Americans are shown in this movie. But the slaves on the plantation, it's Piedmont, South Carolina, and the doctor, I forgot his name, Clarion, I think is, but I forgot he's a white doctor, and he owns this plantation. They have scenes depicting the slaves on the plantation as singing and dancing and entertaining the slave master and his family. And the movie puts forth this narrative, this image of the happy slave and a kindly slave master treating his slaves as almost like part of the family. Okay, so then the Civil War comes through and it destroys the South, and it disrupts their whole way of life. So then you have the Reconstruction era, and the Reconstruction era is a period of time when you have African Americans being elected to Congress. You're going to have about 20 African American men elected to Congress. You're going to have 2 U.S. senators. This is depicted in the movie also, and they show them as being ignorant. They show there's a scene that takes place in the halls of Congress that show that tries to undermine these African American congressmen and shows them as being totally unfit to serve in Congress, shows them eating fried chicken in Congress, all different types of derogatory things like this, right? This is all depicted in the movie. So this movie comes out in 1915, debuts February 8th, 1915. African Americans, we had enough sense back then to protest against the movie. See, this is something that's not talked about. We understood the movie was detrimental to our existence, okay? How you doing, John Ray? John Ray of workingwithjohnray.com. How you doing, John Ray? We understood that the movie was detrimental to our existence, okay? So the NAACP in 1915 led protests against this movie. William Monroe Trotter, when the movie came to Boston, led protests against this movie because, I mean, this is at a period of time where each year you're having a massive number of lynchings of African Americans. No one's being arrested, no one being held accountable, no one being prosecuted. And this movie caused race riots in the streets. The movie The Birth of a Nation was based upon a novel by a man named Thomas Dixon. The name of the novel was called The Klansman. When the movie, the novel The Klansman was turned into a play. When the play in 1906, the play is traveling around the different cities. It goes to Philadelphia. There were 3,000 African Americans in Philadelphia that protested against the play The Klansman because we understood it dehumanized us. Okay? When you read Before the Mayflower by Lerone Bennett Jr., in the back of the book, he has milestones in history. Okay? And he talks about 1906. And you turn to 1906, we turn to 1906, he talks about this protest that took place in Philadelphia. Let's go to 1906. This is the 6th edition of Before the Mayflower by Lerone Bennett Jr. October 22nd, 1906, 3,000 blacks demonstrated and rioted in Philadelphia to protest a theatrical presentation of Thomas Dixon's The Klansman. Okay, this was at a theater. It was a play. So we had a history of protesting against this. Now today, what I find interesting is that the same NAACP that was protesting against the movie The Klansman in 1915, I mean the birth of a nation in 1915, because in 1906 the NAACP didn't exist. They came into existence in 1909. The same NAACP in 1915 that led protests against the movie The Birth of a Nation, they'll give image awards to the TV show Empire today. To me, the TV show Empire is worse than The Birth of a Nation. At least that was 1915. How you explain this in 1921, 2019? All the negative images that are depicted of African Americans in the TV show Empire. The same NAACP today gives Empire image awards. I don't understand that. Okay, so you have 1915 was also the 50th anniversary of the end of the Civil War and the 13th Amendment, which ended chattel slavery. Okay, so the 1915 is 6 years before the attack on Black Wall Street. Now we look at 1914 and 1918, World War I. You're going to have 5 million You're going to have 5 million men who go fight in World War I. Most of them white men. You get about 320,000 African Americans. Now, when these white men go fight in World War I, it leaves a labor vacuum. Okay, and then these companies, especially companies up north, they're going to market to African Americans and also immigrants to fill this labor vacuum. So when these white men come back from fighting in a war, they don't have jobs. But they're bringing back with them weapons. They're bringing back with skills on how to fight, and they are attacking African Americans. African Americans came back from World War I as well. We learned how to fight, we learned how to shoot, and we're defending ourselves. So the year after World War I ends, 1919, that's called the Red Summer. James Weldon Johnson, who wrote Lift Every Voice and Sing, the Black National Anthem, he called it the Red Summer because the streets of America were flowing with blood. There were over 25 major race riots in this country that took place in 1919. So then you go into, and also another thing that happened when these brothers came back from World War I, it was a new mentality that we had called the New Negro. The New Negro, okay? And this mentality was, these brothers, they were called race men. These were men who were proud of their race, and they're fighting for the liberation of their race, okay? And when they came back from World War I, they said, look, we fought for this country, we bled for this country, we died for this country. We're not coming back and dealing with the same segregation. We want all of our rights now. They're going to have to be some changes. So they were called race men, the New Negro. So this is this mentality that brothers are coming back to the U.S. with. And in in Tulsa, Oklahoma, North Tulsa, these African-American men, these former World War I veterans, they have this same mentality as well, okay? And we learn how to shoot, how to fight. That's one of the good things about us going fighting in World War I. It's the same thing with the Civil War. There's about 186,000 African-American men who fought in the Civil War, okay? And we learn how to fight, we learn how to shoot in the Civil War. So when we come back, those that survive, when we come back, when the Union troops are removed from the South in 1877 because of the Compromise of 1877, we're going to organize ourselves to patrol and protect our communities, because a lot of us are going to bring back guns from the Civil War. We're going to organize ourselves to patrol and protect our communities when the Union troops are removed in 1877 because of the Compromise of 1877 that ends Reconstruction. Okay, so you have to understand this chronology of history, what's leading up to the attack in 1921. All right, and I go deeper into this in the 2.5-hour lecture that I've done, but I'm just giving you an overview of this here. Okay, so when these white men come back from World War I. They don't have jobs. And you have explosions, racial explosions across this country. Okay? And then you also deal with the new Negro. You have the market, you have the UNIA, Universal Negro Improvement Association. Also, Marcus Garvey comes to the country in 1916, starts setting up chapters. You have this taking place as well. You have also in 1915, you have the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, co-founded by Dr. Carter G. Woodson, September 9th, 1915. And that's going to lead to Negro History Week in 1926 that's going to be founded also. So you have all this taking place around the same time. All right, so let's continue here. How's everybody doing? Now, in 1916, also what we have to understand is that when these lynchings take place, this is oftentimes entertainment for white people. Okay, you just have to understand the dehumanization of African Americans that was taking place. Many times they would take photographs of these lynchings, turn them into postcards. This was oftentimes entertainment for white people. Now, in 1916, there was a man named Harry C. Brown. Harry C. Brown recorded a song for Columbia Records in 1916 called N-Word Love a Watermelon, Ha Ha Ha. I'm not making this up. This is the name of the song. It's on YouTube. You can go listen to the entire song. It's called N-Word Love a Watermelon, Ha Ha Ha. But he ain't say N-word. This is in 1916. This was recorded by Columbia Records. This was a big song. This was entertainment. The dehumanization of African people. This was entertainment. Okay? I've listened to the entire song. It's on YouTube. And what they did was they took the melody of an older song called Turkey in the Straw to be the melody of this song. But the melody of this song is played by a lot of ice cream trucks to this day that still drive in our community. NPR, National Public Radio, had an article about this, and I talked about this back in about 2015 on my radio show. They had an article about this, how one of the most popular songs played by ice cream trucks has a anti-African American history. The name of the article from NPR.com, NPR.org, National Public Radio, is called "Recall That Ice Cream Truck Song. We have unpleasant news for you." Recall that ice cream truck song. We have unpleasant news for you. And this ties into the history of the minstrel shows and the songs played by the minstrel shows. And then some of these same songs played by the minstrel shows were played by ice cream trucks that went throughout communities. Okay, but this song is still played by ice cream trucks today. We'll post a link here on the thread of this broadcast, and you can read this article also. But this is some deep history. Okay, Anthony, how you doing, Anthony? Cedric, okay, Cedric's watching. Selassie's watching. Don't you think African Americans don't you think powerful African Americans mislead us today because of money? What do you mean? Give me an example. Give me an example of what you're talking about. All right. So everybody share this broadcast on your Facebook pages, YouTube channels as well. Invite your friends to tune in. If you like this type of information also, you can donate to the African History Network, paypal.me/the AHN show, paypal.me/the AHN show, or at our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. Click on the yellow donate button. This helps us to keep doing the research, stay on the air, keep broadcasting, finance the Sunday night show. African American business owners, post the name of your business here on the thread of the broadcast. We'll let you know how you can advertise with the African History Network. Also visit workingwithjohnray.com, workingwithjohnray.com. He can teach you about income shifting. Okay, income shifting allows you to shift thousands of dollars a month and help preserve that money. It takes your money back from those who are taking it from you. That's thousands of dollars a year saved, plus they can show you how to earn more. Visit workingwithjohnray.com. His company is MyEcon. MyEcon is a personal financial success company. It's African American owned also. Visit workingwithjohnray.com. Workingwithjohnray.com. Now also, we have a new advertiser. We know summer is coming up and people are trying to get their sexy back, and I'm back working out as well. You know, I have a 2-year-old daughter. I want to live to see her, and I ain't have my daughter till, you know, I'll be 48 June 7th, right? So I got started late. But I want to live to see her go to the prom. So I'm back working out, back lifting weights, doing cardio. But the Fast Life 28-Day Challenge can help you get in shape, okay? Visit their website, tfl28.com. Now, this is an online coaching program to help members tap into their body's natural ability to repair itself via fasting. In this 28-day challenge, they focus on utilizing fasting, whole foods, and movement to improve metabolic conditions such as obesity, high blood pressure, pre-diabetes, type 2 diabetes. They have a new 4-week cohort group starting up very soon. Visit their website, tfl28.com, the Fast Life 28-Day Challenge, okay? And this is a 28-day structured fasting regimen that includes healthy habits and 3 coaches holding you accountable on a daily basis. They also have a secret, a private Facebook group that helps you on a daily basis as well, okay? So visit their website, tfl28.com, tfl28.com, okay? All right, let's continue. And then email us at customerservice@africanhistorynetwork.com, customerservice@africanhistorynetwork.com. African American business owners will let you know how you can advertise with us. We have a current promotion, get 2 months for the price of 1. All right, let's continue here. All right, so this is a fascinating history dealing with the history of Black Wall Street. And I had to study, you know, I had to study like a timeline of history leading up to the attack in 1921 to really understand the context in which this was taking place. Now, in 1920, the year before the attack, there were 61 recorded lynchings of African Americans in this country. In 1921, the year of the attack, there were 57 recorded lynchings of African Americans. No one was arrested, no one prosecuted, nothing to see, just business as usual. Okay, all right. And also, when we look at this, no white people were arrested either in the attack on Black Wall Street. No white people were arrested. African Americans were put into detention camps. Martial law was declared, you know, by the governor, but no white people were arrested. I just find that very interesting. Okay. All right, so let's continue. Let's go back to this article from the Washington Post. All right. So while it is still uncertain as to precisely what happened in the Drexel building on May 30th, 1921, the most common explanation is that Dick Rawlins stepped on Sarah Page's foot as he entered the elevator, causing her to scream. Okay, and this is the account from the Oklahoma Historical Society. This is what they reported. Now, the Tulsa Tribune, which is the white newspaper there, published a news story with the headline, "Nabbed Negro for Attacking Girl in Elevator." And they ran an ominous editorial entitled "To Lynch Negro Tonight." Now, soon after this, a white mob gathered outside the Tulsa courthouse, where Dick Rawlins was taken after his arrest. They were confronted by African American men, including World War I veterans, who wanted to protect Dick Rawlins. Okay, a struggle ensued. A shot was fired. Then hundreds of white people marched on Greenwood in a murderous rage. Quote, "They tried to kill all the black folks they could see," end quote. A survivor named George Monroe recalled in the 1999 documentary, "The Night Tulsa Burned." The Night Tulsa Burned. There were reports that white men flew airplanes above Greenwood, dropping kerosene bombs. Quote, "Tulsa was likely the first city in the United States to be bombed from the air," according to a 2001 report by the Oklahoma Commission to study the Tulsa race riot of 1921. They called it a race. See, the Oklahoma Commission, they call it a race riot. No, it was a massacre. It wasn't a race riot, it was a massacre. Now, if we look at Hannibal B. Johnson's book, Black Wall Street from Riot to Renaissance in Tulsa's Historic Greenwood District, which is probably one of the best books dealing with this history. On page 46, he talks about what happened the morning of June 1st. Okay, and he said most of the fierce fighting on the night of May 31st to June 1st took place between Archer Street and the Frisco Railroad tracks. Now, the Frisco Railroad tracks separated South Tulsa, where the white people live, from North Tulsa, where the African Americans live. The beginning of the Greenwood Business District was at the intersection of Greenwood, Archer, and Pine. Greenwood, Archer, and Pine, those streets. This is where it said the Gap Band gets their name from, G-A-P, Gap, Greenwood, Archer, Pine. Okay, so took place between Archer Street and the Frisco Railroad tracks. Among the many horrors amidst the confusion and chaos of the riot, a car dragging the corpse of an African-American man paraded proudly through town for all the world to see. This is from page 46 of Black Wall Street, from Ride to Renaissance in Tulsa's historic Greenwood District by Hannibal B. Johnson. Okay, a car dragging the corpse of an African-American man parading proudly through town for all the world to see. Now, Tulsans reported seeing trucks loaded with corpses in downtown Tulsa and in some white neighborhoods. By midnight, the beleaguered African Americans retreated fully to the Greenwood District. Okay, now whites began congregating along the railroad tracks north of First Street and east of Elgin Street, E-L-G-I-N, Elgin Street. An unfounded rumor that a trainload of African American men from Muskogee was on the way to reinforce their brothers in Tulsa caused Sheriff McCullough to block and turn back one train, fearing an ambush by an angry mob of armed whites. By dawn, this is dawn of June 1st, 1921. By dawn, some 15,000 whites had amassed, ready to strike at the heart of Tulsa's African American community, and strike they did. By 6 a.m., the African American community had been invaded wholesale by frenzied armed white men, white boys as young as 10 years old, white boys as young as 10 years old, armed and unduly disrespectful of both law and person, participated in all aspects of the brutality, mayhem, and horror that transpired. Incredibly, whites remained free to taunt and terrorize African Americans, invading their homes and plundering their possessions at will. The long arm of the law did not extend to these acts. The long arm of the law did not extend to these acts. The fate of African Americans, systematically disarmed, rounded up, and deprived of their liberty, depended upon the kindness of their captors. This law enforcement strategy of neutralizing African Americans virtually assured the total decimation of the black community. In practice, it left the Greenwood District defenseless and vulnerable, and extended an open invitation to the thieves, arsonists, and killers who ran roughshod through the street of Tulsa. At the height of the riot, carloads of marauding white Tulsans streamed into the streets, firing indiscriminately at any African American target in sight. Women and children proved no exception. An elderly African American couple kneeling in bedtime prayer in their Greenwood Avenue home was startled by an invading mob. After murdering the couple execution style, the mob ransacked and pillaged the house before setting it ablaze. The line between civilization and savagery had been crossed. African American homes became mere booty, the spoils of roving bandits set afoot in the Greenwood District with no purpose other than theft, destruction, and too often death. An African American woman who lost her home in the riot recalled, quote, after they had the homes vacated, one bunch of whites would come in and loot. Even women with shopping bags would come in, open drawers, take everything. They should have said white women, because that's who it was. White women with shopping bags would come in, open drawers, take every kind of finery from clothing to silverware and jewelry. Men were carrying out the furniture, cursing as they did so, saying, quote, these damn Negroes have better things than lots of white people, end quote. I stayed until my home was caught on fire. Then I ran to the hillside where there were throngs of white people, women, men, and children, even babies, watching and taking snapshots of the proceedings of the mob. Some remarked that, quote, the city ought to be sued for selling damn N-words property so close to the city, end quote. One woman noticed the First Baptist Church, which was the First Baptist Church of North Tulsa, which is a beautiful structure located near a white residence district. She said, quote, "Yonder is an N-word church. Why ain't they burning it?" End quote. The reply was, "It's in a white district." Okay, so that's a first-hand account. That's from page 47 of Hannibal B. Johnson's book, Black Wall Street: From Riot to Renaissance in Tulsa's Historic Greenwood District. Okay, so get this from your local African American bookstore. Okay, or if they can't get it, I'm sure you can probably get it on Amazon. All right, so that's a first-hand account of what happened. Now, what we have to understand is that in spite of all of that, we rebuilt Black Wall Street also. This is what a lot of people don't talk about. All right, so if we go back to the article from the Washington Post. Okay, so soon a white mob gathered outside the, what I want to tell you. Okay, so you had, there was a group of African American men that swelled up to a number of about 200 armed black men outside the jail where Dick Rowland was. They went there to back up the sheriff to protect Dick Rowland because there was a mob of about 500 white men who wanted to take Dick Rowland out and lynch him. Okay, so this is often not talked about. There were brothers who were armed that went to protect Dick Rowland. Okay, so soon a white mob gathered outside the Tulsa courthouse where Dick Rowland was taken after his arrest. They were confronted by black men, including World War I veterans who wanted to protect Dick Rowland. A struggle ensued, a shot was fired, then hundreds of white people marched on Greenwood in a murderous rage. George Monroe recalled in the 1999 documentary, The Night Tulsa Burned, he said, quote, "They tried to kill all the black folks they could see," end quote. Now, there were reports that white men flew airplanes above Greenwood, dropping kerosene bombs as well. B.C. Franklin, a Greenwood lawyer and the father of famed historian John Hope Franklin, wrote a rare first-hand account of the massacre later donated to the National Museum of African American History and Culture. He said, quote, "The sidewalk was literally covered with burning turpentine balls. For fully 48 hours, the fires raged and burned everything in its path, and it left nothing but ashes and burned safes and trunks and the like that were stored in beautiful houses and businesses. Burned safes, S-A-F-E-S, safes, like where you keep money, burned safes and trunks and the like that were stored in beautiful houses and businesses," end quote. And when you study this history, when they were looting the homes, okay, they would systematically shoot the locks off the homes, go in, ransack the homes, carry out pianos, things like this, and then set the homes on fire. They did this systematically, house after house after house after house. All right. Now, what's interesting here? Well, okay, so a couple things to keep in mind. The Ku Klux Klan helped to instigate the atmosphere and instigate the animosity that white people, especially white men, had towards these African Americans. You have to keep in mind, it was white people who instigated segregation. It was white people who instigated segregation and relegated these African Americans to North Tulsa. They become prosperous. They build businesses. They get involved in the oil that's discovered. And now you're jealous of what they created, but you're the one who segregated them. Now you're jealous of what they were able to accomplish. Okay? You had African American men who were so rich that white men would come into Tulsa, in North Tulsa, to borrow money from them. Now you're jealous after you segregated them. Okay, so all right, so let's continue here. So you had over, the number that from Ebony, the number from Linda Christensen was 1,265 homes that were destroyed. Yeah, hundreds of homes looted. You have between 4,000 to 10,000 or so people who were left homeless. You had over 1,000 African Americans who spent the winter in tents because their homes were destroyed. Okay, martial law is going to be declared as well. All right, so this is a deep history. So on June 1st, 1921, martial law was declared. Troops rounded up African American men, women, and children and detained them for days. They had detention camps for them. They had to wear green identification badges. Okay. Now Olivia Hooker, who passed away in November of 2018 at the age of 103. She was the last known survivor of the Tulsa Massacre. Okay. Now, NPR.org has an article about this from May 31st, 2018, when she was still alive, called Meet the Last Surviving Witness to the Tulsa Race Riot of 1921. This is from May 31st, 2018, written by Nellie Giles. Now, there's an update to this article. The update says, since this piece was published, several people have reached out to tell us the story of Hal Singer, H-A-L-S-I-N-G-E-R, Hal Singer. At the time of the massacre in 1921, Hal Singer was just 18 months old. His mother worked as a cook in wealthy white homes in Tulsa. See, this is what I'm talking about. See, you had a lot of poor African Americans who lived in Tulsa. Everybody wasn't rich, okay? And they were domestics working in South Tulsa for white people, okay? So his mother worked as a cook in wealthy white homes in Tulsa. Now, that was in South Tulsa. They didn't say South Tulsa, but that was in South Tulsa because white people didn't live in North Tulsa. As the violence began, one of her employers helped Hal, who was 18 months old at the time, and his mother escape on a train to Kansas City. Hal Cornbread Singer, nicknamed Cornbread, went on to become a successful jazz saxophonist and band leader. He is now, at the time of the article in May of 2018, he was 98 years old. Okay, so that's a footnote to this. So he was actually the last known survivor, but Olivia Hooker was one she was the last survivor who could give an account of what happened because she was 6 years old at the time. All right, so let's go back to the article from Washington Post. Okay, so June 1st, 1921, martial law was declared. Troops rounded up African Americans, women, and children and detained them for days. Olivia Hooker, who was 103 and died in November 2018, is one of the last survivors of the massacre. Olivia Hooker was 16 years old when the violence erupted. Her mother hid her and 3 siblings under the dining room table. Olivia Hooker said, quote, she said, keep quiet and they won't know you are under here, end quote. Okay. Now, she said they took everything they thought was valuable. They smashed everything they could not take. She said, my mother had these Enrico Caruso records she loved. They smashed the Caruso records. Now, Olivia Hooker, who later became one of the first African-American women to join the Coast Guard, and from what I see, from my research, she was actually the first African-American woman to join the Coast Guard as well. And she goes on to get a PhD in psychology also. She has always lived with her memories of that racial terrorism. Okay, she said, quote, you don't forget something like that. Okay, she said, and she ended up moving to New York. Okay, at the time of this article in 2018, she lived in New York. She said, you don't forget something like that. I was a child who didn't know about bias and prejudice. It was quite a trauma to find out people hated you for your color. It took me a long time to get over my nightmares, end quote. Now, it wasn't until 1998 that authorities began investigating the claims of mass graves. Investigators used electromagnetic induction and ground-penetrating radar to search for evidence at New Block Park, which operated as a dump in 1921, Booker T. Washington Cemetery, and Oaklawn Cemetery. Okay. All right, and let me, I've got the article printed up here. Let me go to this right place here. Okay. Now, at each site, they found anomalies. Quote, they merited further investigation, end quote, according to the commission's report. Okay. The Oklahoma Commission to Study the Tulsa Race Riot of 1921. And, you know, them calling it a race riot, especially like white people calling it a race riot, and African Americans saying it was a massacre, that's similar to the That's similar to the argument over, say, the 1967 Detroit Rebellion. You have white people who want to call it a riot, and some African Americans who are confused want to call it a riot, and other African Americans who are more conscious saying, no, this was a rebellion. Okay, and it's the same thing I said when we had the 50th anniversary of it in 2017. You know, I did shows dealing about this, and I was saying, no, this was a rebellion. We were rebelling against white supremacy and racism. We were rebelling against police brutality, things like this. This wasn't just black people just going crazy. No, we were rebelling against a system of white supremacy and racism. And in 1967, there were 159 violent uprisings across this country. Okay, now all of them were not on the scale of a Detroit, but there were documented 159 violent uprisings across this country of African Americans rebelling against white supremacy and racism. And because of the rebellions that were taking place, especially in 1967, June 28th or July 28th, June 28th, 1967, President Johnson convenes the Kerner Commission, okay, to study the rebellions and what was causing them and what can be done about them. They were looking at the rebellions from 1964 to 1967. But June 28th, he convenes the Kerner Commission, okay, and they're going to produce their report in March of 1968. And the report, blackpast.org, has an article about it, dealing with the Kerner Commission. And people need to read that, because when we talk about reparations and making legal arguments for reparations, in the Kerner Commission report, they talked about what was causing the rebellions. And they talked about the poverty, lack of education, lack of opportunities. They talked about the investment that needed to be made in inner cities. They linked this to white supremacy and racism. Okay? They laid it out. All right? So that is something that needs to be looked at again. We know in March of 2018 was the 50th anniversary of the Kerner Commission report. Okay? And there were articles written about it, but it was really glossed over. Okay, that needs to be looked at. And when we talk about creating an African American agenda to present to presidential candidates, but not just presidential candidates, it needs to be presented to members of the House of Representatives, it needs to be presented to members of the U.S. Senate, it needs to be permitted to city council, people running for city council, people running for mayor, county commissioner, state legislature, governor, and not just for president. If you just present that to the president and don't present that to members of Congress, they're the ones that write the bills and pass the damn bills. Most of the bills, yeah, presidents can do executive orders, but most of the bills go through Congress, then signing the law by the president. Okay, we don't understand this. That needs to be presented to people all across the board, not just the president. So I'll go to blackpast.org. Okay, PAST, blackpast.org, and they have about 13,000 pages of articles dealing with African history and African American history, and they have a really good article dealing with the Kerner Commission. We'll post a link here. I have to pull it up. Let's see, which one is that one? Blackpast.org. AtlantaBlackStar.com has a good article. I'm looking at some of the articles I have bookmarked. Yeah, National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders. Okay, that's what the Kerner Commission was called. Yeah, 1967, National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, Kerner Commission. This is an article from blackpast.org. And they talk about how, July 28, 1967. That's when it was. It was the day after the Detroit Rebellion ended. Okay, because the rebellion in Detroit started July 23rd, 1967 at 12th and Claremont in Detroit. And they talk about here, just very briefly, in responding to why the rebellions occurred, the Kerner report pointed to Black Americans' frustration and feelings of powerlessness regarding extremely high rates of unemployment and underemployment, poverty, police brutality, and inadequate public services. The report, now this is towards the end of the Great Migration, keep this in mind. The report continued that a largely poor black population was confined to the central cities while a predominantly white population moved out. This was the white flight. Okay, and this was the white flight that was spurred by the end of World War II, which ends in 1945. Then in because you had these racial clashes that took place as more African Americans are moving up north, you have these racial explosions that happen. There was a huge race riot in 1943 during World War II in Detroit, up and down Woodward Avenue. Okay, there was a huge race riot that broke out. And then when 1945, the World War II ends in 1945, the baby boomer generation starts. These white men come back home. They're having families. Their families need to expand. You have the 1949, you have the Federal Housing Act, which allows white people to put 3% down on low interest loans and get houses built out in the suburbs that were being formed. When African Americans tried to take advantage of these homes, we were being discriminated against. When we tried to use these loans to buy property in the inner city, we said these were high risk areas. They were using the redlining system, which was created by another government entity called the Homeowners Loan Corporation. The redlining system was created in 1933 the Homeowners Loan Corporation was created in 1933. The redlining system was created in 1934. And this is going to be used to discriminate against African Americans to buy properties in the African American community. So what this starts is the deindustrialization of the inner city. We see this going back to the late 1940s. Then in 1952 and 1956, you have the U.S. Interstate Highway Acts. The U.S. Interstate Highway Acts that drive 41,000 miles of U.S. interstate highways through the African American community. They run through about 1,600 African American communities, wiping out thousands of businesses, wiping out our homes. And they're moving these businesses and these industries, these white businesses and industries, out of the inner city into the suburbs. White people are moving into the suburbs, okay? And we see this taking place in the 1950s, 60s, continuing in the 1970s. They're locking African Americans in the inner city. Then you're having these jobs move out, plants close. And we see this with the auto industry as well. We saw this hugely in Detroit. When these new auto plants, and new plants in general, but especially auto plants, when they're being formed in the suburbs, they're formed of what were called sprawling campuses. So they were not the traditional multi-story plants like the Packard plant that's still in Detroit right now. They were on these sprawling campuses, and these new plants had more automation in them. And what this automation did, it eliminated a lot of the low entry level jobs that a lot of our fathers and grandfathers got when they moved up here from Mississippi and Alabama and Tennessee, things like this. All right, it eliminated a lot of those jobs. Okay, so you have these jobs moving in these industries, moving from the inner city, and African Americans be locked into them. This is leading to the racial explosion that we're seeing in 64, 65, 66, and 67. This is what the Kerner Commission is talking about. Okay, they said in responding to why the rebellions occurred, the Kerner report pointed to Black Americans' frustration and feelings of powerlessness regarding extremely high rates of unemployment and underemployment, poverty, police brutality, and inadequate public services. The report continued that a largely poor Black population was confined to the central cities while a predominantly white population moved out, and that the racism of white Americans was, quote, essentially responsible for the explosive mixture, end quote, leading to the uprising. This is what the Kerner Commission is saying. Okay, the racism of white Americans was, quote, essentially responsible for the explosive mixture, end quote, okay, leading to the uprisings. Answering what can be done to prevent this in the future, the Kerner Commission suggested that the federal government intervene to improve housing, education, employment opportunities, and social services for African Americans. This is what white people are saying needs to be done. The Kerner Commission, there may have been one African American, I can't remember, there were 11 people on the Kerner Commission, okay? It was called the Kerner Commission after, it was named after the governor of Illinois, Otto Kerner, okay? It was named after him, okay? And he was the chairman of this commission. Now, this is what white people are telling you, all right? They're saying, answering what can be done to prevent this in the future, the Kerner Commission suggested the federal government intervene to improve housing for Black people. They wasn't talking about housing for poor white people. They're talking about housing for African Americans, okay? Housing, education, employment opportunities, and social services for African Americans. Also, to dismantle discriminatory practices in education, employment, the police force, and criminal court systems. All right? Let me repeat this. Also, the Kerner Commission suggested to dismantle discriminatory practices in education, employment, the police force, and criminal court systems. President Lyndon Johnson, who was the president at the time, who convened the Kerner Commission, accepted the report but did not support the conclusions. And minimal efforts were made to address the problems identified by the Kerner Commission. Now, at the same time, he's dealing with the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War took away a lot of attention from the civil rights movement and made it harder for us to get our issues and needs addressed because the Vietnam War dominating the headlines, dominating the news every night, dominating the front page of the newspapers. March of 1967, Dr. King was interviewed by NBC News. They did a 26-minute interview with them, and they talked about beyond civil rights, black power, beyond civil rights, black power. A couple years ago, they digitally restored the video. You can watch it at NBCnews.com, NBC News website. And in this interview, this is the month before. This is March of 1967. So this is the month before Dr. King officially comes out in opposition to the Vietnam War. That was April 4th, 1967. He officially came out in opposition to the Vietnam War. And 4 or 5 days before that, March 30th, 1967, is a famous press conference, or a famous interview. Don't know if it was an actual press conference. There's a famous interview that was done with Dr. King and Muhammad Ali. And it's on YouTube. You can watch it. And they were talking about being in opposition to the Vietnam War. And Dr. King and Muhammad Ali had a secret friendship that a lot of people don't know about. Biography.com has an article about this. The secret friendship between Muhammad Ali and Dr. King. And in the same month, they came out in opposition to the Vietnam War. Dr. King came out April 4th, 1967, his speech called Beyond Vietnam. And then later that same month, April 30th, 1967, so it was 1967, April 4th, 1967. And April 30th, 1967, Muhammad Ali refused to be drafted into the Vietnam War, to the army to go fight in Vietnam. He refused to be drafted. Okay, that's all in the same month. So, Dr. King, in the interview with NBC News in March of 1967, he talked about how, because of the Vietnam War, it made it more difficult for those in the civil rights movement to get their issues addressed, to get the proper news coverage and things like this. Okay, so go watch that interview that they did with Dr. King, March of 1967. Okay, let's continue. How's everybody doing? Share this broadcast on your Facebook page. Invite your friends to tune in. Also, if you like this type of information, you can donate to the African History Network. PayPal.me/the AHN Show. PayPal.me/the AHN Show, or at our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com, right on the home page. And then the DVD lecture I have dealing with the history of Black Wall Street, that's also available at our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com as well. Okay, it's on sale right now. We have it on DVD and digital download. I'll post the link. I'll post a link for that here as well. Okay, so let's continue here. This is a fascinating history dealing with the history of Black Wall Street, Tulsa, Oklahoma, but it ties into other history also. Okay, this is why we have to understand a chronology of history. When I teach the history, I deal with a chronology of history, not I teach the history chronologically as opposed to episodically. Okay, so let's go back to the article from Washington Post. Okay, and this is an article in Tulsa, a century-old race massacre still haunts Black Wall Street. They was killing black people, right? By Deneen, who was this? Deneen L. Brown, I think it was. Deneen L. Brown. Okay, so Olivia Hooker, right? She lived to be 103 years old. At the time, she was the oldest known survivor of the Tulsa massacre. And she said, "You don't forget something like that." She said, "I was a child who didn't know about bias and prejudice, okay? It was quite a trauma to find out people hated you for your color. It took me a long time to get over my nightmares. Now, it wasn't until it wasn't until 1998 that authorities began investigating the claims of mass graves. Investigators used electromagnetic induction and ground penetrating radar for evidence at New Block Park, which operated as a dump in 1921. Booker T. Washington Cemetery and Oaklawn Cemetery. At each site, they found anomalies, quote, that merited further investigation, end quote, according to the commission's report. Then in 1999, a white man named Clyde E-D-D-Y, who was 10 years old at the time of the massacre in 1921. He came forward and told officials he was playing in Oaklawn Cemetery in 1921 when he spotted white men digging a trench. When the men left, Clyde Eady said he peeked inside the wooden crates and saw corpses of black people. Now, based on Clyde Eady's story, state archaeologists began investigating the section of the cemetery Clyde Eady cited. The effort was led by Clyde Snow. Okay, Clyde Snow is one of the world's foremost forensic anthropologists who had helped identify Nazi war criminals and had determined that more than 200 victims found in a mass grave in Yugoslavia had been killed in an execution style of ethnic cleansing. Now, using ground penetrating radar, they made a dramatic discovery, an anomaly bearing, quote, all the characteristics of a dug pit, D-U-G, dug pit or trench with vertical walls and an undefined object within the approximate center of the feature, end quote. The commission concluded, quote, with Eady's testimony, this trench-like feature takes on the properties of a mass grave, end quote. Now, Vanessa Hall Harper, the African-American city councilwoman, said this is sacred ground. The history is being ignored, and I think it's intentional, end quote. Now, the commission created by the Oklahoma legislature in 1997 to establish a historical record of the massacre recommended, quote, a limited physical investigation of the feature being undertaken to clarify whether it indeed represents a mass grave, end quote. That never happened. Now, Susan Savage, who was mayor of Tulsa, Oklahoma at the time, there in 1997, at the time of the proposed excavation, said in a recent interview that she had numerous discussions with officials and raised concerns about the excavation. She said, quote, Oaklawn Cemetery is a public lot. I asked, how do we do that without disturbing graves of family buried there? She said, I wanted to know how we could protect and preserve the dignity of people there, end quote. Now, Bob Blackburn, who is a white man that served on the commission, said he agreed with the decision not to dig at Oaklawn Cemetery. Okay, quote, based on all the evidence Clyde Snow looked at, we never could pinpoint something, he said. In my mind, that is not an unresolved issue. In terms of proving there was a mass grave, there will always be people thinking one way or the other, end quote. Now, the refusal to excavate this portion of the cemetery was a blow to Vanessa Hall Harper, the city councilwoman. And she said, along with the city's decision to ignore a recommendation for reparations to survivors and descendants of survivors. So to this day, they still have not been paid reparations, even though the survivors and their descendants have been fighting for reparations. There was a documentary called Before They Die, which deals with the history of the Tulsa race riot and their efforts to fight for reparations. Now, Vanessa Hall Harper worries that the gentrification underway does not include efforts to resolve lingering questions about the violence. She said, quote, this is sacred ground as developers are making decisions about the Greenwood district. The history is being ignored, and I think it is intentional. They want to forget about it and move on, end quote. All right. Now, J. Kavin Ross, Kavin. J. Kavin Ross, who wrote about the mass graves for the Oklahoma Eagle newspaper, which is an African-American owned publication that has been headquartered in Greenwood since 1936, said gentrification has pushed many African-American residents and descendants of massacre survivors out of Greenwood. Now, this is something similar that happened in the 1970s when the expressways ran through Greenwood also. The expressways displaced a lot of African Americans, displaced some of the businesses that were still there, okay, as well. The expressways run through in the 1970s, and now you have gentrification coming through, displacing more African Americans as well. Okay, he said, J. Kavin Ross said, quote, with gentrification, we say, now you want to take an interest in Greenwood and pimp our history. And you are going to build these apartments down here, and you know darn well we are not going to spend $1,000 for a closet room. Okay? He said we will never be able to afford to live in Greenwood. Now, at Greenwood and Archer, in the heart of Negro Wall Street or Black Wall Street, sit 14 red brick buildings that were reconstructed soon after the 1921 massacre. Okay, because we rebuilt Black Wall Street. They are all that's left of the original Greenwood. Now, on a hot summer afternoon, David Francis pushes open the door at Wanda J's Cafe, a soul food restaurant where African American and white residents mingle. Now, David Francis, who's 32 years old, lives nearby and loves Wanda J's chicken fried steak, and green beans. He's a white man born and raised in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and he said he first heard about the massacre when he was in high school. He said, quote, it's unbelievable to think the genuine atrocity took place right here. Looking outside the restaurant window onto Greenwood Avenue. He said, quote, a white woman told me she remembered seeing bodies dumped into the Arkansas River off a bridge, end quote. Now, the African American diners at Wanda J's fear the changes in Greenwood, including One OK Field, which is the minor league ballpark that opened in 2010, and the luxury Green Arch apartment complex, which features a yoga indoor cycling studio. The BMX headquarters, BMX bike racing, BMX headquarters and track are set to open in 2019 on the edge of the historic district at Archer and Lansing. Okay, now Bobby Eaton Sr. is 83 years old, and he calls the influx of white businesses and residents a quote-unquote a tragedy. Junior Williams, 56 years old, said gentrification is driven by the same forces that fueled the white mob nearly 100 years ago. Junior Williams said, quote, there was economic jealousy that caused them to destroy Greenwood, end quote. And that's exactly what happened. There was economic jealousy. Now, at Lefty's on Greenwood, where the crowd is overwhelmingly white, Nikki Atchoy, Atchoey, says she moved into Green Arch Apartments because of its history. But Atchoy, a 39-year-old white realtor who grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, learned the details of the massacre only 6 years ago. Now, she was 33 years old. She didn't learn about the Tulsa massacre until she was 33 years old. Okay, Nikki Atchoy said it is really not something taught in schools. Okay, adding that many white people moved to Greenwood oblivious about the history. I wonder why it's not taught in schools. She said, quote, I think that is unacceptable. People come to the area and go to the bars and ball game. The stadium is like building a Whole Foods at the site of the Oklahoma City bombing. She said, what they're doing there, that's like building a Whole Foods at the site of the Oklahoma City bombing. Now, as evening falls, the crowds heading to the baseball game walk over the plaques in the sidewalk dedicated to businesses destroyed in the massacre. Near the stadium's entrance, under Interstate 244, a mural is signed Tulsa Race Riot 1921. Someone has crossed out riot and written massacre. Someone else has crossed out massacre and left a scribble of black spray paint. Imagine that. And yeah. Okay, so that's the article from Deneen L. Brown for the Washington Post. Okay, in Tulsa, a century-old race massacre still haunts Black Wall Street. They was killing black people. That's from September 28th, 2018. We'll post a link here to the article on the thread of the broadcast. And NPR.org had a good article also dealing with Olivia Hooker. She was 103 years old at the time of the article. This is from May 31st, 2018. Okay, so this is a few months before she passed away. Now, it's important to note that despite the destruction, we rebuilt Black Wall Street. So the rebuilding of North Tulsa begins in 1922, and over 80 businesses were opened, okay, in 1922. Tulsa banks or lending institutions would not make loans in the Greenwood District. During the 1940s, an African-American business district listed over 400 businesses in the Greenwood District. By the end of the 1950s, more than half of the businesses were abandoned or closed, okay, by the end of the 1950s. In the 1960s, because of civil rights, some upwardly mobile African Americans leave North Tulsa and move into white neighborhoods. Also, what's going to happen is, let me see, I think this is a quote this is okay, here's a quote from page 98 from Hannibal B. Johnson's book, Black Wall Street, From Riot to Renaissance in Tulsa's Historic Greenwood District. Quote, by the end of the decade, more than half of the businesses were abandoned or closed. Okay, and this is by the end of the 1950s. Okay. By the end of the decade, more than half of the businesses were abandoned or closed. Stable employment during the war years had provided new opportunities for home ownership. The rooming house, a source of progress just after the turn of the century, became virtually obsolete in the 1950s. And this is going to be some of the first businesses there in Tulsa. The rooming house. So we see O.W. Gurley, who owned one of the first businesses. He's going to own a rooming house. Now, ironically, the civil rights movement or civil rights actions of some Tulsans that broke down racial barriers helped to break the back of the Greenwood District. Few of the affected property owners had insurance. Those who did were notified that unless they could prove that either the city or the state was negligent in the protection of their property, the insurance policy would be void. Given the realities of race relations, this proved an impossible task. What is more, the insurance companies disclaimed liability for fires caused by rioting or civil insurrections. Okay, and let's see here. Let's continue. All right, and so what's going to happen is that you're going to have African Americans who start spending more money in South Tulsa, the white area of Tulsa. You're going to have African Americans who move out. Some of the pioneers of Black Wall Street are going to die off. Their heirs, their next generation, some of them are going to sell off the land, move away. And then in 1970s, you have the expressways that come through also, okay, that wipe out a lot of what's left. By 1961, more than 90% of African Americans' income in North Tulsa was spent outside of the Greenwood District by 1961. And let's see, desegregation integration calls many of us to take our dollars out of the Greenwood District to white stores, and the expressways come through in the 1970s. there's a historical marker. Now there were other Black Wall Streets also in Parish Street in Durham, North Carolina. This is where you have the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company. There's a historical marker there in Durham, North Carolina, that says in the early decades of the 1900s, Durham acquired national reputation for entrepreneurship. Businesses owned by African Americans lined Parish Street, P-A-R-R-I-S-H. Among them were North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company, and led by John Merrick. John Merrick was a former slave, by the way. Dr. Aaron Moore, C.C. Spalding, and Mechanics and Farmers Bank, founded in 1907, led by R.B. Fitzgerald and W.G. Pearson. Okay, so FinancialJuneteenth.com has an article dealing with, yes, there was more than one Black Wall Street. They talk about Parish Street in Durham, North Carolina. It was known as Black Wall Street in the late 1800s and early 1900s. His name was patterned after Wall Street in New York City. And they talk about, let's see here. So they talk about Durham and talk about Greenwood Avenue. Then they talk about the Black Wall Street in Jackson Ward, Richmond, Virginia. This began after the American Civil War, when the already freed African Americans worked together with the newly freed slaves to establish a business center. Among those who pioneered the creation of the Commerce Center were editor John Mitchell Jr. of the Richmond Planet, which was an African American gazette, and Maggie L. Walker, who was both an African American and a person with a mobility impairment. She was the first woman to charter and become president of an American bank, Maggie L. Walker. Okay, now Jackson Ward was also famous for being an entertainment center. It was also known as the Harlem of the South. Among those who have often performed there were Duke Ellington, Ella Fitzgerald, Bill Bojangles Robinson, Lena Horne, Cab Calloway, Billie Holiday, Nat King Cole, and James Brown, the Godfather of Soul. At the intersection of Chamberlain Parkway and West Leigh Street, Leigh, stands a statue of Bill Bojangles Robinson dancing on a staircase to further leave the impression or an atmosphere of entertainment in the vicinity. Okay, so this was another Black Wall Street, Jackson Ward, W-A-R-D, Jackson Ward in Richmond, Virginia. Okay, so there were, even though the majority of African Americans are going to be poor, live in poverty, things like this, you still have these prosperous communities that exist in the early 1900s. If we look, lastly, if we look at the article from NPR.org from May 31st, 2018, meet the last living surviving witness to the Tulsa race riot of 1921. This talks about Olivia Hooker, okay? And in the article, she talks about how it was a horrifying thing for a little girl who's only 6 years old, trying to remember to keep quiet so they wouldn't know we were there. Her mother told her to keep quiet. On May 31st, 1921, 6-year-old Olivia Hooker was home with her family in Tulsa, Oklahoma, when a group of white men came through the backyard carrying torches. Her mother quickly hid Olivia and her 3 siblings under the dining room table, covering them with a tablecloth, and told them not to make a sound. Olivia Hooker told Radio Diaries, quote, "It was a horrifying thing for a little girl who's only 6 years old, trying to remember to keep quiet so they wouldn't know we were there," end quote. So the men entered the house and began to destroy. Now this is a first-hand account of what happened. The men entered the house and began to destroy anything they could find of value. They broke her father's record player and took an axe to her sister Irene's beloved piano before moving on to other homes and businesses in the community. Now, let's see. Before the events in May of 1921, the Greenwood district of Tulsa was predominantly African-American neighborhood, known for a thriving middle class. The main strip, Greenwood Avenue, was lined with successful black-owned businesses, including the Hooker family's store, which sold quality brand name clothes. So her family owned a clothing store there in Greenwood. She said it was a neighborhood where you could be treated with respect. Okay. Now, Greenwood may have been a haven of African Americans, but the state of Oklahoma had strict laws limiting the rights of African Americans. Schools, hospitals, trains, stores, restaurants, even public phone booths were segregated, and miscegenation was a felony. Okay, white people, specifically white men, intermixing, having sexual relationships, romantic relationships with white women. Okay, this was a felony. Now, lynchings were not uncommon, and by 1920, the Ku Klux Klan was emerging in the state. So the Klan became very powerful in Oklahoma. And as I said before, the Klan helped to instigate a lot of the animosity, the racial animosity between white people towards African Americans. Okay. All right. So, okay. So they have some reports from newspapers, the New York Times and the New York Times, June 2nd, 1921, and June 3rd, 1921. So. All right, so the mobs were met by a group of armed African-American men, many of whom were World War I veterans. After a confrontation, shots were fired, and thus began a day-long assault. This is talking about the African-American men who go to the jail to back up Dick Rowland. All right. Olivia Hooker said, "My father's store was destroyed. There was nothing left but one big safe. It was so big they couldn't carry it away, so they had to leave it in the middle of the rubble," end quote. Now, the New York Times reported June 2nd, 1921, quote, "Fires had been started by the white invaders soon after 1 o'clock, and other fires were set from time to time. By 8 o'clock, practically the entire 30 blocks of homes in the Negro quarters were in flames, and few buildings escaped destruction. Negroes caught in their burning homes were in many instances shot down as they attempted to escape." This is reported by New York Times, June 2nd, 1921. New York Times reported June 3rd, 1921. Okay, now let's see. Reports varied widely. Initial estimates put the death toll somewhere between 36 and 85. One report released by Maurice Willows, who directed the American Red Cross relief efforts, estimated that as many as 300 were killed. So that's where the count starts, with at least 300 killed, going by the American Red Cross, because the American Red Cross set up a makeshift hospital in Booker T. Washington High School there in the Greenwood district. Okay, and they're tending to the wounded and things like this. So when we look at the accounts, it starts at 300. The Tulsa race riot is considered one of the worst incidents of racial violence in American history. Now, June 3rd, 1921, the New York Times reported, quote, this was General Charles J. Barrett, okay, who stated this, quote, "In all of my experience, I have never witnessed such scenes as prevailed in this city. When I arrived at the height of the rioting, 25,000 whites armed to the teeth were raging in the city in utter and ruthless defiance of every concept of law and righteousness. Motor cars bristling with guns swept through your city, their occupants firing at will," end quote. All right, so that was another report from the New York Times, okay? Now, in 1945, Olivia Hooker became the first African-American woman to join the U.S. Coast Guard. She went on to earn a doctorate degree in psychology and helped form the Tulsa Race Riot Commission in 1997 to investigate the massacre and make a case for reparations. So Dr. Hooker, at the time of this article, she was 103. She's going to pass away in November 2018 at 103 years old, and she was known to be the last surviving witness to the Tulsa race riot in 1921. Okay, so check out this article also from NPR.org. entitled Meet the Last Surviving Witness to the Tulsa Race Riot in 1921, written by Nellie Giles, May 31st, 2018. We'll post a link here for this as well. All right, so that deals with some of the history of the Tulsa Massacre and some of the history of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Now, Tulsa was founded by Creek Indians around 1836, who get pushed off their land in southeastern United States because of the Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed by President Andrew Jackson. And the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Cherokee, and Seminole Indians are going to be pushed off their land in southeastern United States, in Georgia, Alabama, places like that. And they're all forced to go out west over 1,000 miles of what's known as the Trail of Tears. And when they go, they all go into Oklahoma. And when they go into Oklahoma, they take their black slaves with them. They all what are known as the 5 civilized tribes of Native Americans. They all own black slaves. So they all take their black slaves with them. Okay, and then this is going to lead to the what's known as the Black Freedmen Indian Treaties of 1866, because compensation is going to be given to these former slaves. This is after the Civil War ends in 1865. Land is going to be given to them. Dr. Claude Anderson has an article at his website, harvestinstitute.org, harvestinstitute.org, called Harvest Institute Freedmen Federation Lawsuits and the 1866 Indian Treaties. And you've heard me interview him a number of times. We've talked about this. But in the article, it talks about how the federal government also offered amnesty to the 5 civilized tribes in the form of the 1866 Indian Treaties, which remain the basis which the government has provided preferential benefits to Indians for the last 150 years. The 1866 treaties required Indian tribes to free their black slaves and grant freed blacks, black Indians, and their descendants full tribal membership and voting rights in all matters pertaining to the tribes. The treaties mandated that the federal government and the tribes provided the black freedmen and black Indians with no less than 150 acres of land, $160, equal share in all government, provided material benefits, free schooling, reservation resources, and to be treated in all matters similar to the way non-black members of the tribes were treated. Today, that would include free college education, tax-exempt status, and the right to own and operate gambling casinos. They also get free casino licenses, not just free radio station licenses, TV station licenses, things like this. These are benefits that are still in effect today, and most of the black people and black Indians who were getting these benefits, they were pushed out of this in 1941. Okay, in 1941, the United States government provided guidance to tribes on how to redefine Indian, the term Indian, what an Indian was, in a way that excluded black freedmen and black Indians. The government has continually narrowed its sphere of enforcement and has ignored its fiduciary responsibilities to the black freedmen and black Indians as defined in those treaties. It is that failure that is the basis of the Harvest Institute Federation's lawsuit. Okay, so visit Dr. Claude Anderson's website, harvestinstitute.org, H-A-R-V-S-T, harvestinstitute.org for more information about the Black Freedmen Indian Treaties of 1866 and the lawsuit he has. I've interviewed him about it before. He talks about how this has to become a mass movement. Okay, it can't just be him and a few black Indians fighting for this. This has to be a mass movement. Most African Americans don't know about this history. And what happened was, former slaves of the Creek Indians there in Tulsa got land, and this land these are going to be some of the first landowners there in the Greenwood District, which is going to become Black Wall Street. And they got land because of these treaties. Remember, Tulsa, Oklahoma was founded by Creek Indians around 1836. Tulsa comes from the Creek Indian word Tallahassee. This is where it originates from. Okay, so Tulsa, Oklahoma has a Native American origin. It has an African American origin, slave origin, things like this. And you're going to this is a fascinating history, and you're going to have African Americans in Oklahoma in general that get these benefits also. All right, go ahead and post your comments here before we get out of here. How's everybody doing today? How you like this type of information? Be sure to visit our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. We have a lot of information there for you, and then my full 2.5-hour DVD lectures dealing with the history of Black Wall Street and the attack. We have them there. We have them on DVD and digital download as well. The DVDs on sale $10, digital downloads on sale $8. And we also have bundle packs there on our website also of my lectures. Now, starting June 8th, 2019, we have the new online course that I'm teaching. And it's going to be live. It'll be at our online school, the African History Network school. It's Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Ma'afa, understanding the transatlantic slave trade, what they didn't teach you in school. Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Ma'afa, understanding the transatlantic slave trade, what they didn't teach you in school. This will be a 8-week, it'll mainly meet on Saturdays, probably about 4 p.m. to 6 p.m., 8 weeks, 16-hour course, 2 hours each installment. We'll deal with thousands of years of history. We'll deal with the origins of the transatlantic slave trade. We'll deal with ancient Egypt. We'll deal with some of the history of the Africans known as the Moors. We'll take the teachings from ancient Kemet into Europe. And this brings Europe out of the Dark Ages. And this leads to this is going to lead to the transatlantic slave trade taking place. When you really understand a chronology of the Africans known as the Moors being in Europe, and this leading to the transatlantic slave trade, then you really understand that the transatlantic slave trade was really Europeans getting revenge on Africans, on the Moors, on the Africans, who brought Europe out of the Dark Ages. There were conflicts and fights between the Moors and Europeans, but also these Moorish men were intermixing with white women as well, and changing the complexion to various extents of the European population, especially in Spain and Portugal. We see it also in Sicily. We see it to a lesser extent in England and Germany and Austria, because those countries are further away from where the Moors are going in from Morocco into Spain and Portugal. But we definitely see it a lot in Spain and Portugal. We see the Europeans have a darker complexion. We're going to see the impact that the Moors have on European societies and the foods they introduce. They're going to introduce the periodic tables. They introduce something called alchemy, which today we call chemistry. We see it in the architecture, in the art, in the paintings. We see it even in things like Shakespeare's play Othello, which is about a Moor. Othello was a Moor. We see it in the universities that are erected, like the University of Salamanca in Spain, built by the Moors and Arabs in about 1285 AD. In a lot of the early European universities were created to study the Moorish science text. University of Toledo, University of Bologna, things like this. They were created to study the Moorish science text, the teachings that the Moors were introducing into Europe. We see it in the names that you're going to see in Europe as well. Names like Maurice. Okay, Maurice is in reference to a Moorish boy. We see Marie was Latin, and we see this go through different European languages. But when we look at the name Mauritania, Mauritania means land of the black-skinned people. They talk about this, I think, on page 5 of Golden Age of the Moor. So we see that the variations of the word Moor influenced European society, influenced Spain, influenced language, influenced the languages. They leave a lasting impression all throughout Europe, okay? And we're also going to see that you have the worship of the Black Madonna child that existed before the Moors go in. But you're going to see these statues that still exist today of the Black Madonna and child as well, which come from Asar, Aset, and Heru, the story of the trinity of Asar, Aset, and Heru, who the Greeks called Osiris, Isis, and Horus. And Aset giving birth to Heru or Horus through a virgin birth, December 25th, which is a retelling of these story, which is the story of the Virgin Mary giving birth to Jesus, is a retelling of this ancient story of Osset giving birth to Heru. Okay, then if you read Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization by Tony Browder, he talks about how this holy trinity of Asar, Osset, and Heru goes back to at least 3300 BC in ancient Nubia, what was called Ta-Nehesi. And Nubia is the mother of Egypt, or Kemet. So this is ancient history that we see retold over and over again. And we see, this go all around the world. All right, so email us at customerservice@africanhistorynetwork.com for more information about the online course I'm teaching starting June 8th, 2019. I'm putting together the link for that, so that'll be available for you to register very soon. All right. So hopefully you learned something from this broadcast. Follow us on our YouTube channel, Michael Imhotep, Imhotep on YouTube. Follow us on our Facebook fan page, the African History Network. Turn on the notifications so you know when we go live. Listen to the African History Network show Sundays, 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on 9:10 a.m. the Superstation, WFDF, the Future Radio. All right, and then also we have a couple new advertisers. African American business owners, email us at customerservice@africanhistorynetwork.com. We'll let you know how you can advertise with the African History Network. We have a couple of new advertisers also. It's 2019, and Martisha Patterson, who's a certified financial planner, can help you get your financial house in order. Visit her website, pattersonplan17.com, pattersonplan17.com. She can help you with budgeting, saving, investing, preparing for retirement as well. No one's situation is the same. She can help you put together a personal financial plan. Visit her website, pattersonplans17.com. Okay. All right. So, hey, remember the African History Network, we focus on educating, empowering, and inspiring people of African descent throughout the diaspora and around the world. Because right now it's corrects wrong behavior. What you do for yourself, what you do to yourself, what you allow other people to do to you and get away with is based upon what you think about yourself. What you think about yourself is based upon what you have been taught about yourself. What you've been taught about yourself is based upon everything you've read, heard, and seen about yourself. Remember, right now it's corrects wrong behavior. It's not over till we win. Wakanda forever. We'll talk to you next time. Peace.